There is a sentence almost every believer hears at the exact moment something in them gives way. Somebody who loves them says it, meaning every word as comfort. God will not give you more than you can handle. Sit with the logic of that sentence for a second. If God measures the weight to match the one carrying it, and the weight still won, there is only one place left for the blame to land. Not on the weight, on the person who broke under it. That is the part the sentence never says out loud, but it is sitting inside it the whole time. It has been stitched onto pillows, printed on cards, spoken gently at hospital bedsides and funerals, always meant to help somebody stand back up. Which is exactly why it matters whether it is actually true. This was never about the person who said it to you. They were reaching for the kindest thing they knew, in a moment when kind things are hard to find. The problem was never their heart, it was the sentence itself and where it actually came from. That sentence is not a Bible verse. Open every translation you want, King James, NIV, ESV, and the earliest Greek manuscripts behind all of them. It is not there, not as a quote, not as a paraphrase anyone could point to and say, there, that is the verse. It is a mutation of one line in one letter, and the mutation does not just soften what that line says, it reverses it. So if God never said that sentence, the question that actually matters is what he did say. That is not a small correction. It changes what your breaking point was ever supposed to mean. The sentence people quote is a flattened version of one verse. 1 Corinthians 10:13. Paul wrote it at the end of a paragraph he had spent 12 verses building, and that paragraph is not about hardship. It is about an entire generation who walked out of Egypt under a visible cloud, crossed a sea on dry ground, ate bread that fell from the sky, and drank water out of a rock, and still in the middle of all that provision came apart. Paul names exactly how. Some of them worshipped an idol they had built with their own hands. Some of them gave themselves to sexual immorality, and by his own count, it cost 23,000 people their lives in a single day. Some of them tested Christ himself and were bitten by serpents for it. Some of them simply complained, out loud, against the God who was feeding them in the wilderness, and it cost them everything too. Paul had already set up exactly who this warning is for. One verse earlier, "Let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall." Not the person who already knows they are struggling, the person who is confident they would never do what the wilderness generation did. That is who verse 13 is written to, and it is written as a caution before a fall, not a diagnosis handed down after a completely different kind of collapse. You do not need a word of Greek to see what kind of failure Paul is describing. It is right there in plain English, 4 times over, in the same paragraph, well before the line everyone quotes. Most people who quote verse 13 have never read verse 12, or verse 7, or verse 1. Read the whole paragraph in order, and there is no ambiguity left for a clever word to manufacture. Paul spends verse after verse on idolatry, immorality, testing God, and complaining, and then, in the very next breath, promises an escape from temptation. The Greek is not smuggling in a new meaning here. It is only confirming the one the paragraph already gave you. When Paul writes, "No temptation has overtaken you except what is common to man," the word behind temptation is perosmos. It is the word Paul already used for testing Christ in the wilderness, and it names the same category of failure as the idolatry and immorality he just listed. In this passage, it means a pull toward sin, not grief, not illness, not the phone call that changes everything, not the diagnosis, or the year you lost the job and the marriage in the same 6 months. Paul even names who this promise belongs to. Common to man, he writes, using a word that simply means human, ordinary, nothing exotic. Not a rare trial reserved for the spiritually weak. It is the most ordinary word Paul could have reached for. The kind of pull toward sin every person on earth already recognizes. Which means the popular sentence has been applying a promise about resisting sin to a completely different category of pain. One scripture is not even discussing here. This verse was never about your hardship, not your grief, not your burnout, not the weight that put you on the floor. It was never built to be the ruler you measured your collapse against. But if it was never about carrying weight, what was Paul actually promising the people it was written to? Before the next piece. If you have wondered what else in the Bible has quietly been rewritten into something it never said, that is the whole reason this channel exists. It costs nothing to stay for the next one. Paul answers his own question in the same verse. God is faithful, he writes, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but will, with the temptation, also make the way of escape, so that you may be able to bear it. The phrase translated way of escape is ekbasis. It is not a word about inner reserves. It is a word for an exit, the way you leave a room you should not be standing in. Paul is not promising you will find enough strength inside yourself to keep absorbing the pull toward sin. He is promising a door. He does not leave that door abstract either. Look at the very next verse, the line that comes immediately after the one everyone quotes. Verse 14. Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. Flee is not a feeling. It is not a mood you generate or a reserve of grit you dig for. It is a command to move your feet. The way of escape Paul describes is something you do, not a strength you locate inside yourself and hold on to until the pressure passes. Notice too what verse 14 does not say. It does not say, grow stronger or dig deeper. It says flee, which means the word translated bear in your Bible, able to bear it, is doing less work than it sounds like. The Greek is hypenegkian, to carry something through while it is still under you, to hold up under a load for as long as it takes to reach the door. It was never a promise that the load would feel light. It was a promise that the door would be there before the load became the whole story. That is not a small difference if you have been waiting for the weight itself to feel lighter, and it never has. Paul was never promising that it would. He was promising a door, and doors do not care how heavy what you're carrying is. They only care whether you walk through them. So even inside its own subject, temptation, this verse was never a promise of stamina. It was a promise that when the pull towards sin comes, there will be somewhere to go. That is a very different sentence than the one you were given. One promises you can absorb anything without breaking. The other promises you are never trapped. Now look again at how Paul actually phrases the promise. God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able to bear. In Greek, the phrase behind will not allow is uk asai, literally, he will not let. The verb is aeo, to permit, to leave alone. Look at who the subject of that sentence is. God is not measuring you and calculating a matching weight to hand you. He is standing at a boundary, limiting how far the temptation itself is permitted to reach. That is a completely different picture of God than the one hiding inside the popular sentence. The popular version makes God a distributor, someone sizing up your shoulders and deciding how much to load onto them. Paul's actual grammar makes God a gatekeeper, someone holding a line so the temptation cannot go further than you can survive it. A distributor decides your load. A gatekeeper limits what is trying to get in. Those are not two ways of saying the same thing. They put the weight in completely different places. Think about what each version does to a person privately when no one else is watching. Under a distributor, a bigger trial becomes a verdict about you specifically, since someone had to size you up first and decide you could take it. Under a gatekeeper, how far a temptation reaches has nothing to do with a rating anyone gave your character. It has to do with where God chose to hold the line that day, for reasons a struggling person is rarely shown. One model turns every hard season into a report card. The other does not. Paul is describing a much narrower promise than the one you inherited, and the moment you see how narrow it actually is, a much harder question opens up. Because Paul himself, the same man who wrote this sentence, also wrote another one, and in it, he says something about his own life that the popular version of his words would never let him say. Turn from 1 Corinthians to Paul's second letter to the same city. In chapter 1, he tells them plainly what happened to him in the province of Asia. We do not want you to be unaware, brethren, he writes, of our trouble which came to us in Asia, that we were pressed out of measure, above strength, insomuch that we despaired even of life. He does not even say what it was, only that it nearly ended him, above strength. In Greek, hyperdynamon, not up to his strength, not within reach of his strength, above it, beyond it. The same man who wrote that God will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear also wrote about his own life that he was crushed beyond what he could bear. He said it about himself in plain language, with no hedge and no footnote softening it. Of everything Paul wrote, this letter is widely recognized as his rawest, the one where he sets the polish of his other letters aside and writes like a man still catching his breath. If the popular sentence were true, the way people use it, that would make Paul a failure. It would mean he lacked the faith or the strength or whatever it is people assume you lacked when you broke. Paul does not treat it that way for a single line. He tells you exactly why it happened. We had the sentence of death in ourselves, he writes, that we should not trust in ourselves, but in God who raises the dead. Then he adds one more layer most people never get to because they stop reading at the crisis. Who delivered us from so great a death, he continues, and doth deliver, and in whom we trust that he will yet deliver us. Delivered, delivers, will deliver. Paul was not handed strength to make the crushing feel lighter. He was carried through it by someone else, and he says so 3 times in 3 tenses. Put the 2 letters side by side, and there is no contradiction left to solve. 10:13 was never promising you enough strength to survive anything life could bring. It was a narrower, more specific promise about resisting the pull towards sin, and even there, the promise was an exit, not a reserve tank. Being crushed past what you could bear was never the failure the popular sentence implied it was. It happened to the man who wrote the sentence. So if you are the one who broke, under grief, under the diagnosis, under the year that took everything at once, here is what actually changes. You were never being measured against a promise God made about your capacity, because he never made one. The verse you were handed was never about you at all. It was about a temptation you have somewhere to run from, and a God who limits how far that pull can reach. None of this makes the grief lighter or the diagnosis less real. It does not undo the year that took everything at once. It only removes one more weight that was never supposed to be stacked on top of that. The weight of believing your breaking point was evidence against you. Whoever told you the popular version was not trying to hurt you. Most of the time it worked, right up until the day it didn't. The real promise just turns out to be sturdier than the one you were given. You were carrying more than you could handle. He never asked you to. There is another verse people quote the same way, torn out of the one place it was actually written from. Paul says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, and it gets used like a promise of unstoppable success. He wrote it hungry and in prison. If you want to see what that verse is actually promising and what it cost the man who wrote it, that video is right here.